Hello?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon, Dr. Henry. We can hear you.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be in your midst, to be presenting the topic Probiotics and Childhood Diarrhea. I'm Dr. Henry Anyabolu, consultant pediatrician and head of the pediatric gastroenterology unit of Anyabolu University Teaching Hospital. So thank you all the people, the organizers, and the first presenter. I'll proceed to talk about the impact of probiotics and its interaction and relationship with childhood diarrhea. So what are probiotics? The classical definition of probiotics that is currently being used, is the one that was proposed by WHO in 2002, together with Food and Agricultural Organization, which defined probiotics as live microorganisms, which when administered in adequate amounts, confer a health benefit to the hosts. So, but the World Gastroenterology Organization further modified it in 2013 by specifically adding that the probiotics has to be strain specific and also dose specific. Probiotic, going down the memory lane, has been with us from time of history, even as far back as the patient records portray, because various probiotics foods we are seeing on patient records involving fermented foods such as yogurt. They were also seen from archaeological discoveries. But the word probiotic was first used in 1965, and it derived from the Greek probios, which means for life. The Nobel laureate Elie Meshkinov was the one that hypothesized for the first time that yogurt, which contains lactobacillus, led to the reduction of the production of toxin in the intestine, and that was responsible for the long life of Bulgarian peasants. Over 100 probiotic strains have been identified, and they are available in various forms. And especially important to note that they are quite abundant locally. We have a lot of local sources of probiotics. The most important organisms that have been studied in probiotics are the Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG, Bifidobacterium lactis, Streptococcus thermophilus, and the yeast Saccharomyces boulardii. As we've said earlier, probiotics are not ingested as medicines or even as supplements. They can be added or mixed to naturally existing foods. There are terms that are also related to probiotics, which we need to outline and describe in our presentation. The first one is prebiotic. Prebiotics are non-digestible food ingredients that stimulate the favorable growth and activity of indigenous probiotic bacteria. And when you have a probiotic with a prebiotic existing together, we call them synbiotic. Another definition is postbiotic, which tends to elaborate on the product of probiotic organisms themselves. Those products have been isolated, and their impact on the host's microbiological functions are being evaluated. Those ones are the postbiotics. We also have the term functional food. And functional food describes any ingredient that provides a health benefit beyond that which are ascribed to specific nutrients. It must be a food, and it must demonstrate its effects in amounts normally consumed in the diet. So that means that any food that contains probiotics or prebiotics is a functional food. The commonest example we have around it are the life culture yogurt, which contains probiotic bacteria. As we continue in the discussion, we need to be aware that fermented foods, which are very widely available in our environment, may not always be equivalent to probiotics. This followed some guidelines which are highlighted on the reference, which stated clearly the criteria for using the term probiotics. Why, or what are the conditions, or what is the reason why fermented foods are not exactly the same as probiotics? In what conditions, or what could be responsible for that? One of them is that the exact species present in the fermented foods should be known for it to be known as a probiotic. And then the microbes that are present in the fermented food should be demonstrated to grow if the fermented food is cultured. And then, even if it grows, it should be shown clinically or by clinical trial to offer a proven clinical benefit, which is different from its activity in the fermentation process. It will also be shown by evidence that the matrix conveying it, by matrix we mean the conveying vehicle, maybe milk, dairy products, it may be soup, it may be drinks. Those matrix are not inhibitory to the microorganisms. So those criteria must be proved for any fermented food for it to be considered as a probiotic. Talking about fermented foods, Nigeria is not short of abundance of fermented food. In fact, over time, talk of the Ijebu Garri, which has been known to be saving lives since 1400. And then the Iru that is also shown, and then the Opaka, the Oba that has been the subject of many researches, one of which is a highlighted probiotic potential of Nigerian fermented food, the Oba. In fact, Nigerian scientists, especially people in food microbiology as well as food technology, have done a lot of work. The table on the right shows the various organisms that have fermented various food materials to give the fermented product. For instance, Leuconostoc, Lactobacillus, Streptococcus have been involved in fermentation of cassava, which gave rise to Garri, and Garri is a main meal. The same thing happens to whole cassava roots, giving rise to fufu, and then ogi, lafu, iru, ogiri, oba, even palm wine and brokutu. All of them have been demonstrated by Nigerian scientists to contain organisms that are abundant in them, which participated in fermentation process, giving rise to the fermented food. So, other examples of probiotic organisms are highlighted. They can be single-strain probiotics, like as listed on the left, or mixture of probiotic strains, like listed on the right. So how does probiotics work? For us to understand that clearly, we need to really understand the term microbiota. Microbiota are the organisms that are multitude of organisms in their billions that are inhabiting various parts of the body, the gut, the skin, and various parts of the body that have so many functions. For instance, in the diagram that is shown, the gut microbiota are clearly highlighted, and they are active against the pathogens, which are also attacked. One of the effects of their effects is using substances called bacteriocin. Bacteriocin that are produced by gut microbiota also attack the pathogens and help to eliminate them. The other gut microbiota also produce short-chain fatty acids, which, especially with probiotics as well, which also are inhibitory to the growth of the pathogens themselves. And this slide portrays the effect of probiotic on the gut. There are 8 effects that are listed, one of which is the competition for nutrients, and then competes with the microorganisms for nutrients. So that competition for nutrients and binding sites inhibits the activity of the pathogens. It is also involved in various bioconversions of substrates and also assists in recruiting neutrophils to attack areas of inflammation, even also involved in direct antagonism of the microbes themselves. So they activate the inflammatory system and stimulate the immune system in various ways, enhancing the innate immunity by triggering off both the innate and the specific acquired immunity. They are also involved in barrier function. They join to create barriers to hinder the entrance of microorganisms. So these are the summary of the effects of probiotics, especially when they are in the gut, helping to enhance immune defense of the gut and also to battle against gastroenteritis and other sources of inflammation. This also shows the activity of the microbiota and then the probiotics as well. You discover that they help in enhancing the closure of the spaces, the gap junctions. So in the first diagram, which is A, the first one, you see the gap junctions that are open for microbes to enter, but their activity leads to the closure of the gap junctions, and also which limits their entrance from the gut lumen into the systemic circulation. So they also produce mucus layer, enhance the production of the mucus layer through the activity of mucins. And the bacteriocin that we've mentioned earlier, as well as secretory IgA, are also very beneficial, and their effects are stimulated in the presence of probiotics, which helps the activity of the gut microbiota to limit the inflammation and the infection in the gut. What is the basic science of probiotics? So this goes a long way to explain to us, especially regarding as we go ahead to see how to develop our fermented food in the country, our bulk of fermented foods, which if we know about this science and we apply it in development of fermented foods, it will help us to generate a lot of evidence-based mechanisms and inputs into the world global probiotic research. One of them is knowing these cycles. The probiotic should be able to survive, or the organism should be able to survive to the target organ, and it's also shown to interact with host system, which should be proven. Its antipathogenic effects should also be proven. And then it should also be shown to be safe. So some of those probiotics, they must be shown to be safe before they are approved. And also, after being approved, manufacturing concerns are also important. How long is their shelf life on the shelf? So these must be shown and be proved before a probiotic product or fermented food product can be certified as a probiotic and then fit for commercial use. Other things that should be considered in probiotic research, is that the strains should be genus, species, and strain specific. And then studies or clinical trials should be performed with the commercialized product. And then the claim of the probiotic should be one of the endpoints of the clinical trial. And then 2 clinical trials demonstrating those probiotics will be shown, conducted at 2 different centers for it to be included in any meta-analysis. And then the dosage and matrix used in clinical trials should also be identical to the dose of the commercialized product. What's the evidence underpinning the activity of probiotics in childhood diarrhea? We realized that one of the if you consider through our minds back at the level of evidence in evidence-based medicine, of which meta-analysis and systematic review occupied the top echelon. And but we realized that many of the position papers and guidelines and collaboration that are produced by different organizations, they utilize meta-analysis in producing them. So for instance, the EFSGAN Working Group of Probiotics, in their meta-analysis, has shown that they reviewed 63 randomized controlled trials and involving 814 people, children. And then they discovered that probiotics reduce the duration of diarrhea by approximately 1 day and reduce the risk of diarrhea lasting for more than 4 days. And then the majority of those trials were carried out in infants and young children. And the organisms that were used were Lactobacillus GG, Saccharomyces boulardii, and Enterococcus lactic acid bacteria. And also their review, which was supported by the Pediatric Infectious Society, European Society of Pediatric Infectious Disease, also noted that the use of the following probiotics should be considered in the management of children with acute gastroenteritis as an adjunct to rehydration therapy. And those probiotics were Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG and the Saccharomyces boulardii, with strong recommendation and low quality of evidence. We also look at Cochrane 2010 review, which looked at probiotics for treating acute infectious diarrhea. And they studied 63 studies, and they concluded, the results are shown on the right. The conclusion was that used alongside rehydration therapy, probiotics appear to be safe and have clear beneficial effects in shortening the duration and reducing stool frequency in acute infectious diarrhea. They also suggested that more research is needed to guide its use in specific patient groups. And also looking at what the role of probiotics in persistent diarrhea in children. Cochrane also reviewed it, looked at 4 trials, and then concluded that stool frequency was reduced with probiotics in 2 trials. One trial reported a shorter hospital stay, which was significant, but the numbers were small. No adverse events were reported. The other role of probiotics in childhood diarrhea is antibiotic-associated diarrhea, which is not well studied in our environment. It hasn't been well studied, but it's quite common. Most times we tend to overlook it, but I suggest this as an area of interest in future research in the country. Antibiotic-associated diarrhea is quite common. So there are so many randomized controlled trials of probiotic use in preventing antibiotic-associated diarrhea as listed. I'll be a bit fast because of the time, but if you look at all those organisms, studies that have been used, look at Lactobacillus, look at Bacterophidus, and also Lactobacillus reuteri, and then Saccharomyces boulardii. They were all found to be useful, beneficial in antibiotic-associated diarrhea. Also, in preventing infectious diarrhea, there are some conditions. Some children, hospitalized children in the community who have been observed to be prone to diarrhea, and they try to look, giving them probiotics, will it reduce the risk of incidence of diarrhea amongst them? And it was found to be beneficial. The organisms are as listed. We also looked at the recommendation by the Yale and Harvard workshop on probiotics, which was held in 2015, the 2015 update, which I summarized, that showed that in infectious diarrhea in children, in prevention of infection, as well as prevention of antibiotic-associated diarrhea, LGG, S. boulardii, and Lactobacillus reuteri were found to be beneficial. Also, this table outlines various guidelines or world bodies that looked at gastroenteritis in Europe, United States, Latin America, and all over the World Gastroenterology Organizations. The references for further examination and looking at the meta-analysis as well as the forest plots the references will be stated for further examination. These other ones are from, the upper one is using in the Canadian Pediatric Society, which also recommended probiotics, the Chinese guideline, as well as the Asia Pacific guideline, which also looked at probiotics. And though there wasn't any guideline from Nigeria, but it was something that is worth looking at. It was something that there are so many papers, thousands and thousands of papers on probiotics generally, and several hundreds of probiotics in gastroenteritis in children that would be worth looking at, examining, and seeing how we can contribute to world research. Are they safe? Yes, probiotics have been considered to be generally safe and well tolerated. And though there has been rare cases of bacteremia and fungemia, which occurs due to translocation, risk factors for adverse events are listed, especially in prematurity. And then they could lead to development of antibiotic resistance. So over the last few minutes, we'll be able to have a brief overview of childhood diarrhea from the first presenter. And then probiotics, we look at the historicals, indigenous concepts, and the science. Then we also look at role of probiotics in diarrhea. And then we also presented or highlighted that there is a lot of gap from Nigeria regarding pediatricians, regarding